Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first or the second session of Natural Gas World Canadian Gas Dialogues Pandemic Edition. We hope over the next 6 weeks or so to present the entirety of our April 1st pre-COVID event in a virtual setting, starting with this first session on environmental and governance issues. This will be moderated by Bryan Cox of the Canadian LNG Alliance. Joining Bryan on the panel is Cody Battershill, who you can't see because he's joining us by phone. We have Susannah Pierce. She carries several titles at LNG Canada, but I'll just call her spokesperson and chief bottle washer at LNG Canada. We have Severson-Baker from the Pembina Institute here in Alberta. And also on the panel, but he hasn't managed to join us yet, we hope to see him soon, is Mike Cleland from Positive Energy at the University of Ottawa. With that, I will turn things over to Bryan. We'll have each presenter will have about 10 minutes to make presentations, and there'll be Q&A at the end, which Bryan will moderate. Bryan, the screen is yours.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, hello everyone. I trust all of you are healthy and safe wherever you are today. Again, my name is Bryan Cox. I'm President and CEO of the Canadian LNG Alliance. I am joining you here today from the traditional territories of the Kwantlen, Katzie, and Semiahmoo people in Cloverdale, British Columbia. Very happy to be with you to moderate what I know will be a very exciting panel from a very important, diverse group of individuals who are making a difference in the dialogue in this country, and in not only talking the talk, but walking the walk. And I think that's the real key of this session today. It's the real key of this whole dialogue, I think, around what Natural Gas World is set up is what do we take from these sessions in this time when we're not able to connect face to face? It's still so important that we come together and find ways of connecting with each other and coming together in our communities, in our cities, in our province, and in our country. It's absolutely essential right now for us to move forward as a country and to rebuild the economy and to continue to provide prosperity to Canadians from coast to coast to coast. That is truly our opportunity, and really this industry is at the center of this. And I think the group that's been gathered today to talk about a topic like ESG, one that we talk about so much right now, but is still very ill-defined, one that we all talk about we know it because many of you, and I'm sure all of you on the line are within the industry. We know that we're industry leading, that we're leading as a jurisdiction in what we're doing, but how do we define ESG in a way that we can measure it and continue to demonstrate to the world that what we're doing is world leading? And when you look at things like a couple of things that have been come out in the last few days even, and when Mike joins, I think he might be able to speak to this as well, but there was a survey put out by Positive Energy just last week with a variety of questions, and the one I found the most interesting was around a question around sending our natural gas to parts of the world to displace emissions there. It was so interesting to see how that survey question was packaged up, because it packaged it up by ideology, so left to right of the spectrum. And I encourage you to go look at this chart, because when you do, you'll see that all the bars on the graph are almost exactly the same, showing that there is broad agreement that one of the best things we can do to combat climate change is to send our natural gas overseas to displace dirtier fuels. So it crosses spectrums. And I think right now in public policy development, we are so divided in so many things. And in fact, we basically position ourselves over what we're against rather than what we're for. And I think an industry like the natural gas value chain, especially our LNG opportunity, is a very unifying one. And one more point I'll make is around a recent report that was released by the Conference Board of Canada showing what a growing LNG sector could do for the country. In this scenario that was put forward, 56 million tons a year, includes the first phase of the LNG Canada project. So that's why it's great to have Susannah here today. And what growing the sector could look like when it comes to prosperity for Canadians. And the very interesting thing about this report is it broke it out by province and importantly by sector. So it shows that when we build big things, when we are brave and we come together and we build big projects, everyone benefits, whether you're in retail, manufacturing, accommodation and food services, tourism, all of the sectors right now that we know are troubled benefit from a growing economy. And it's our chance right now to engage Canadians in that dialogue. I was part of a panel last week where the mayor of Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario came and spoke to BC mayors and councillors, talking to them about how the natural gas industry in British Columbia benefits his city and how we need to grow it because it only benefits him and his fellow residents in Ontario. That's a very powerful dialogue that we need to build on, and it's through ESG and that discussion around what it means for us in Canada that I think can take us to that next level. This is not about being Pollyannish. This is not about saying things that aren't going to happen. We have to walk the walk. And again, that's why I think this panel is so well structured. So let's get to the dialogue, because this is what you came to hear, is these folks. So again, I'll introduce them very quickly. Their bios are on the website. We have Cody Battershill from Canada Action. We have Susannah Pierce from LNG Canada. We have Chris Severson-Baker from the Pembina Institute. We have Mike Cleland from Positive Energy at the University of Ottawa. Very, very good group of folks, and I'm glad you're all here to listen to them. Let's get energized about energy. Let's keep ourselves going. We got a great group today. So I'm going to start things off with Cody from Canada Action, who can talk to us a little bit about what he's seeing out there in the public space and his thoughts on ESG generally. So Cody's not on the screen, he's on the phone, but I think he does have some slides. So Cody, over to you for your comments.
Thank you very much, Brian. Really appreciate it. Apologies for my webcam issues today. It's a real pleasure to be back with Natural Gas World again this year. Really appreciate being included in this really important discussion, and it's great to be on a panel with such esteemed colleagues, Susannah, Mike, Chris, and of course yourself, Brian. You know, this first slide I wanted to just include to kind of reframe where we're at in the world. And, you know, we are talking a lot about the environment, about social issues and governance issues. Energy demand is continuing to grow. That's energy for all sources of energy. Canada is currently a leader in renewables. We're also a leader in a number of these other important energy sources that the world is depending upon. And we have a real opportunity to continue investing in wind, solar, hydro, biofuels. But the fact is that world demand for natural gas is continuing to grow. We do know that today fossil fuels are about 80% of global energy demand. That was, about 85, 90%, 25, 30 years ago, and it's forecast to still be above 70% in the next 20 years. So it's very important when we are talking about energy that we don't get too focused on one. We can really be supportive of all of these sources. We need natural gas and wind. We need natural gas and solar. And, it's a very important part of this, just to reframe kind of where we're going. Over the last 10 years, when we look at natural gas's percentage of global energy, it's about 22, 23%. And when you combine wind and solar, it's about 1.7%. And it's not to be anti one or the other, but we need to include all in this important discussion. I think for investors looking at Canada's place in the world, you want to invest in a jurisdiction where there's this incredible importance that's been placed on renewables, with this opportunity to continue to produce responsible, clean, green, inclusive natural gas. So I think that's an important part of this conversation, that natural gas is going to continue to be very important. Next slide, please. We look at the recently released BP energy report, and in all three scenarios, talking about a peak in oil and natural gas production, you still need a tremendous amount of investment to replace the declines of existing production. And so when we look at Canada's geographic location in the world, when we look at Canada's hydro and clean electrical grid, this opportunity with a major LNG export project to reduce global emissions by an equivalent amount to 15% of Canada's total is something that we cannot absolutely ignore. And we should actually be talking about how we can replicate this to improve investment. Really where we need to see sort of a level playing field is we have governments talking about the importance of the environment and ESG. We have investors that are very focused on this. We need to see everyone working together so that we can accept and we can understand we have this opportunity right now in front of us. And it's something that we can't afford to pass up again. And we need to make sure that we're attractive for investment. I think companies that want to add some additional ESG into their decision-making metrics around where they might invest should be looking at Canada really as a choice jurisdiction. We do have a hydro advantage. We have this commitment to climate action, and we're not doing ourselves or the global environment truly any favors by ceding possible market share to other producers. We should be able to compete. We should be able to get our responsibly produced natural gas to the world. Next slide, please. When we do look at the G component of ESG, you know, Canada is ranked 4th in the world on the Resource Governance Index. Sorry, next slide, I apologize. Can you just pop over to the next slide, please? That's okay. I'll continue talking while that gets changed. So, you know, when we do look at the G component in, you know, in ESG, Canada is ranked 4th in the world on the Resource Governance Index in its most recent year available. Our energy regulation is world class, which is why many other countries have actually come to Canada to learn how, you know, we've been able to do things. And so, you know, we can continue to obviously teach other countries, and we can continue to be a great world example for how to do things, but we also can always do better, and we never stop improving. So having that balanced conversation, you know, people are focusing a lot around climate as a part of the E in ESG, but we also need to be talking about the social and the governance aspects as well that are very, very important. When we look earlier this year, I think at some of the media coverage surrounding Coastal GasLink, you know, what we need to remember is that there is a lot left out often in these conversations, specifically thousands of pages, meetings, calls, contacts, and other attempts, and ultimately negotiations and formations of these partnerships with Indigenous communities, with stakeholders, with local businesses to be a part of these programs and to be a part of these important projects. There's many of these communities that do want to continue to lift themselves out of poverty. And I don't think that it's you know, we should be talking about not ignoring that social and governance consideration for these local communities around all the work that Canada is doing on the Indigenous side of responsible resource development. We do often hear blanket statements from potential opponents of development that do not reflect that total, that big picture. So I think it is very important that we continue to you know, advance that and move that forward. Next slide, please. So we kind of look at natural gas, and I put this together to show, so we have the world's top 10 natural gas exporters, and then you look at all these different metrics. And for ESG rankings, you know, you go from transparency to the rule of law, peace, environmental performance, press freedom, sustainable development, resource governance, as I mentioned. On all these metrics, Canada is a leader. We're among the top couple countries for natural gas exporters. And so getting our natural gas liquefied and to world markets is incredibly important so that we can continue to advance leadership in these important, you know, these very important values. We've seen the US and Australia build massive investments into infrastructure, and we need to do the same so that we can maximize the value to our families and to our society. Next slide, please. And this is my last slide. I just wanted to end it with the E again in ESG. And so we look at, you know, former executive director of the International Energy Agency, and we have this capacity to produce our LNG with lower carbon. So what we should be sharing that with the world, because we are talking about a global issue of climate. This is one aspect of Canada's potential for climate action. And we can't ignore this when we are talking about the environment, when we are talking about this global big picture. So Now more than ever, in a situation of economic recovery from COVID, we need to be getting our energy and our resource sector, pulling its full weight and contributing its full potential. And I don't believe that ESG can exclude Canada and Canadian energy because we are leaders. We do need, we will always continue improving, but we do have a great record that we can be proud of. So I wanted to leave it there, and thank you very much for having me again this year.
Great, thank you very much, Cody. Those were great comments, and I think a great first presenter to the dialogue today. And you look at what Canada's opportunity truly is, and I appreciate that you talked about our multiple commodities that we have in Canada. I think we've been mired in a pretty polarized discussion, focusing really around oil for the past few years, and I think we have a real opportunity to move forward with opportunities like LNG, metals and minerals, our clean hydroelectricity grids. It's a real true opportunity for unifying on that, which will only continue to provide opportunities for prosperity and for those ESG metrics that we're seeing. And I think it really is a good segue into the next presenter with Susannah, because she has just been so instrumental, her and the LNG Canada team, to walking the walk when it comes to ESG, to showing the prosperity that can happen, the environmental outcomes that can be achieved, the social side on the Indigenous partnerships and prosperity that we're seeing right now, training opportunities, gender equity opportunities. These are stories that most of Canada have no idea about. And when you ladder into that this is $40 billion of private sector investment laddering into our economy right now, it's pretty powerful. And I think one of the biggest statements and one of the biggest thanks we can give to LNG Canada is they were able to stay operational during this COVID period and continue with the project, employing thousands of people. That's huge right now, and it shows that it can be done. It shows that we can do more. And so I'd like to pass it to Susannah now, because I think this is walking the walk in action, and I think everyone will benefit from hearing Susannah's perspective. So over to you.
Thanks, Bryan, and thanks, Cody, for that great introduction. Thanks for taking the time, everybody, to listen to us today. So it's been some time since I've had the opportunity to give an update on this project, and maybe let me just start with that, because I think it's useful for those of you that don't track this project every day just to know where we are. And Bryan, as you mentioned, we did continue construction during COVID, continued construction today. Of course, we did ramp down significantly with our EPC, JGC Fluor in order to manage a lot of the challenges of physical distancing. But we were beginning to ramp back up, again, still applying the various different COVID-19 protocols that we need to keep people safe. So it's been an incredible exercise of trying to build a mega project in the midst of a pandemic and all of the other major economic challenges, market challenges that our industry is experiencing. So the complexity of this project and this industry doesn't seem to go down. It only seems to get more challenging. And then when we layer on what I think is a very important approach to how we develop projects today, the ESG elements of project development, it even becomes more challenging and complex. But I think for all of us who have families and children and live in the world today, we know that these are worthwhile pursuits. We know that pursuing as much as we can to develop projects in a way that provides benefits to communities, that protects the environment, that ensures that there's appropriate governance and sharing of benefits, this is ultimately how projects are being developed. And this project, of course, LNG Canada, would not have happened in British Columbia unless we had some of those key elements in mind. And again, it's something where this is not going away. And in fact, these are the sorts of things that the goalposts will continue to shift. And so as industry, we have to be mindful about those continuing shifts. Why? Because we have a finite planet. Why? Because we have a climate that needs action. Why? Because we have people who have not had the opportunities that we have had to share in some of these benefits. So we must, first of all, accept that ESG is here. We must find ways of embracing it and moving our industry forward. You know, I reflect just last week, you had 200 executives from the Business Roundtable in New York City sign on to the Paris Agreement, essentially 80% reduction in GHGs by 2050. That hadn't happened before. And in fact, a 1.5 degrees Celsius climate, maintain a 1.5 degrees Celsius change. So again, the first stop for all of us is you have to recognize it is here. and individually look at our businesses and understand what can we do. And we all have various different financial capacities of doing it. We all have various different investor pressures. But the one thing we are beginning to see increasingly is it's not just about us. Customers are beginning to ask these questions too. Most recently, McKinsey came out with a buyer survey, and they survey essentially 80% of LNG buyers. And what they saw in this survey was that approximately 33% of those indicate that within the next 2 to 3 years, carbon intensity will be a factor by which their buying decisions will be made. And so as a result of that, how do we now look at how we produce our products? Now, LNG Canada, from the very beginning, I think a lot of it has to do with our joint venture participants who have a lot of experience all around the world, had some initial decisions that set us up, I think, relatively well for that point in time. One of the first things we did, of course, when we began this project is, of course, recognizing the traditional territory of many of the First Nations upon which we would build a plant and then the carriers would travel. And where I sit right now in Vancouver, I'm on the traditional territory, the Musqueam, Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. And of course, recognizing that changes your approach to how you may engage communities of Kitimat, Terrace, but then also First Nations communities. So we embraced that. We entered into agreement with these nations. We ensured that we would develop contracting strategies as well as local content strategies that would benefit both local and Indigenous companies. And to date on that project, I think we're at about $2.2 billion that we've invested directly into local and Indigenous companies. That then enables capacity building, that then enables economic reconciliation. And so those are some of the things that from the beginning we embraced. On the carbon intensity side of things, back in the day when we had to make a decision, what type of power supply are we going to use to essentially liquefy the LNG, the natural gas? It takes a lot of power. If we were to use all electric, that would be 1,000 megawatts for a facility of our size. At the time, there wasn't 1,000 megawatts in BC. In addition, at that time, if you were going to pull 1,000 megawatts from the system, you're also pulling in gas plants. You would have to procure from IPPs. Not all of that was going to be renewable. So what we ended up doing is choosing one of the most efficient gas turbines ever created in the world for power production. That's the LMS 100 from GE. We ended up then sourcing a certain amount of our power supply from BC Hydro, which was renewable. And therefore, we were able to drive down the carbon intensity of the plant to among the lowest in the world. In fact, it is going to be the lowest in the world of any large-scale facility today that's in operation. We're about 35% better than the best, 65% better than the average, weighted global average facility in the world today. So that was another initial decision that we made, again, in anticipation of where the world is going on some of these key criteria. Now, will that always be the case? No, I don't think it will. In fact, I think the rest of the world, as I mentioned earlier, is beginning to also say, hey, we also need to be paying attention to this. Customers are going to start asking for this. And so we need to continue to be mindful about how do we continue to show that we are keeping pace with where society is going. And then finally, from a life cycle analysis perspective, maybe just bringing it back to what is the role of LNG in the world. So there is a need for natural gas going forward in the world. And in fact, it needs to be natural gas that is produced with the lowest amount of carbon possible. But that's going to require that we enter into arrangements and agreements with organizations so we can get there. Because as I said, customers are going to continue to look for that. And if we really want to show that LNG can back up more carbon intensive sources of energy, we need to demonstrate that. So we recently conducted a life cycle analysis at LNG Canada looking at the production of natural gas all the way through to consumption in China. Now, I think it would be wrong to say that all of the natural gas that's produced at LNG Canada will go for electricity generation in China, because we know that renewables are in fact more economic than natural gas is. But what we also know is that renewables don't run all day long. And so you do need to have baseload power. Now the choice, for a lot of these consuming countries, is it coal or is it natural gas? And what we're seeing as a result of a number of different policy choices, clean air initiatives, is increasingly natural gas that can be used instead of coal to backstop renewables. What we're also seeing is increasing amount of natural gas for both industrial and residential heating. So that is the other side of this whole life cycle analysis, that we produce it well over here, and then when it goes to the end consuming nation, that it's actually being used for the right purposes and not cannibalizing lower carbon intensive sources of energy like renewables. So again, I think the opportunity for us right now, in the middle of looking forward economic recovery, is that the concept of building back better, the concept of growing an economy that has a low carbon advantage, is something that we have in front of us right now. It's something that I think we can continue to work on so that we can drive investment in this country, so we can actually continue along this cycle of developing lower carbon intensity commodities that we can export to the rest of the world, that will increasingly be looking for those things. Thank you, Bryan.
Thank you, Susannah, for those very clear, concise statements on what our opportunity is and what your project is doing to contribute to that. I will take a moment for those of you listening, if you do have questions, because we do have this great group assembled, please do ask them in the chat. We will get to them when we get through the remarks. So I think the power of these dialogues is through the engagement. And like I say, we are in a different place where we're not all together, but we need to stay connected. So we need to hear from you, and we need to have this dialogue. We've got a great group put together who can have this conversation. So with that, I will now pass it over to our next speaker, who is Chris Severson-Baker from the Pembina Institute. And I think a great addition to the panel, as we have the conversation around not if we develop these resources, but how we develop them. And I think the opportunity continues to be working together, having conversations together, not having conversations in echo chambers or in silos. And that is truly the way forward, I think, for not only our industry, but for us as a society and as a country. We need to de-silo ourselves and get around a table and have conversations. And so having Chris here, I think, is a great addition to the group. So over to you, sir, for your comments.
There we go, just unmuting myself. Now, hopefully everybody could see my screen. You can see the title of my presentation here is Towards a Differentiated Natural Gas Market. So please holler if there's any technical issues that I need to be aware of. But thank you for inviting me to speak to you today. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about the Pembina Institute a little bit, and then introduce myself and also the work that we've done around helping to create the first deal in Canada for certified natural gas, and also some of the opportunities that we can foresee in the future around certified natural gas in Canada. Gotta figure out how I can change my slides. There we go. So the Pembina Institute. I should mention first of all that I'm based in Calgary. I recently returned to the Institute after being at the AER for 3 years, and I was with the Institute for a number of years before that. And I was really excited when I came back to find out that in my absence, this project had been initiated and was at a mature stage, and I had the opportunity to help with the rollout of it earlier in 2020. And the Pembina Institute, for those that don't know, it's an environmental organization, a clean energy think tank. We really focus on climate change and energy. We're national. We have offices in other jurisdictions in Canada, particularly Toronto and Vancouver, but we got our start in Alberta. We do research and analysis. We convene and we recommend and we advocate for various kinds of solutions, policy, implementation of policy type recommendations as well. So certified natural gas, this is something that interested Pembina because, well, first of all, certified natural gas is basically saying, this gas that's produced meets certain criteria, and it provides consumers with who want to be able to discriminate between different sources of natural gas and opportunity to do that. So, somebody might be very concerned about wanting to ensure that the gas that they're consuming is meeting a certain environmental standards, social and ethical standards, and this is a way for them to do that and sort of exercise their power in the market to encourage that kind of thing. We're interested as an organization because we need to transition to less carbon-intensive energy sources. Natural gas can play a role in that, and it can play a role in deep decarbonization, particularly as a feedstock for hydrogen. And when we're seeing progress in Canada around driving down the upstream emissions associated with producing natural gas, we see Canada as leading in that regard internationally, and this is a way of recognizing that and creating an incentive to continue down that path. And we recognize that this there's an opportunity to create a competitive advantage for producers that have got their act together in terms of ESG. And I really agree with what Suzanne said. This is an example of embracing ESG and embracing climate leadership, and it produces a triple win. So for producers, for consumers, and for the environment. So the initiative was occurred between Energir, Pembina Institute, Equitable Origin, and 7Gen. So obviously, most people know 7Gen is a producer of natural gas. Energir, a distributed company based in Quebec. Equitable Origin is an organization that's focused on creating a certification program and implementing it. Our role in this process has really been to sort of help to bring parties together in Canada and to help to validate the overall program, and we'd like to continue to play that kind of role. And we see there's interest of these four partners in continuing to try to expand this in Canada. And I'll talk about that a little bit more towards the end. So how it started, Energir approached Pembina to help with designing a responsible gas procurement program, produced a couple of reports, looked at different programs that are around, and ultimately engaged with the stakeholders that Energir identified to find out what it is that they were most interested in. It resulted in us recommending a particular framework that sort of met the interests of the stakeholders, which then led to a pilot project with 7 generations and recommendations about how to proceed, and ultimately the first deal. This slide covers the full range of concerns that we heard during that engagement process. So you can see that they're quite diverse. Methane emissions, the upstream emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions was definitely a key one. But it wasn't limited to the climate impacts here. And that really prompted us to pick this particular certification program because it went beyond climate change. It covered all the bases that the stakeholders had identified. So if you were to sign up for this, go through this process, you'd be looking at corporate governance, transparency and ethics, human rights, Indigenous people's rights, labor and working conditions, as well as climate, biodiversity, and environment. And the way it works is you would as long as you become a sort of level 1 if you're meeting best practices across the industry and are transparently demonstrating that. You can move to level 2 if you're going beyond best practices, and 3 if you're truly a leader in your sector. And so we also like the fact that it provides that sort of expansion of ESG and recognizes like different levels of performance in the space. And so the process includes a self-assessment initially. Then there's independent site verification with EU Equitable Origin approved assessors. There's a development of an improvement plan to address any gaps identified, and then there's desktop reviews with site level verification. So those are the kinds of steps you could contemplate undertaking if as a company who might participate in this. So the first announcement that I mentioned happened in February. 7 Generations is still the first and only producer to achieve this certification. And the Energir collects payment from its customers and provides a premium to 7 Generations who's indicated that they're investing that in a sustainability fund. We think this represents an improvement in terms of transparency, public disclosure, and it recognizes leadership in implementing ESG best practices in Canada. Where we're at now, the model has received really a lot of positive attention. The original 4 partners are continuing to dialogue together, through this pandemic period. We're aware of a number of new companies that have initiated this certification process under EO. And what we're really interested in at this stage is, the next logical step for this would be to identify, a half a dozen producers, several buyers, perhaps some intermediaries who would like to have a strategic dialogue about how to expand natural gas certification in Canada and how to, address any barriers that might exist, as well as capitalize on the advantages, both, in terms of domestic sale of natural gas as well as international. So that's what we see as the next steps. I feel like we've got a little bit slowed down in this initiative because of the pandemic and the inability to easily get people together and that sort of thing. But as we are right now demonstrating that people are figuring out how to overcome that barrier, and we're keen to engage in that conversation going forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. I think that was really informative on, a really important piece of work that's just really showing that, taking what we are leaders in and putting it in a place that people can understand, and they actually get some metrics around ESG. And I think that's, obviously the really important thing is how to continue to have this discussion. Is it's not just a conversation; it needs to ladder into actual demonstratable metrics that can be measured against and used from a commercial point of view to continue doing what we're doing as an industry. So thank you very much for your remarks. And I think, again, this way this panel's structured is really, really good, because I think it bridges really well into Mike Cleland's comment, who I think will give a perspective around, what are some of those practicalities in developing ESG metrics, and what can that look like, and where we are at from a public policy point of view to actually get some of those outcomes coming together. So again, Mike Cleland is a senior fellow with the Positive Energy at the University of Ottawa. Really a pleasure to have you here today, Mike, to give your remarks. So over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Brian, and glad to join you. So I've got a number of slides here, and I'll step through them reasonably quickly. As you said, my focus is on the implications for public decision processes, and more particularly regulatory processes, implications of ESG and vice versa. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what we're doing at Positive Energy and how that bears on this. So next slide, please. So a lot of you know a lot more about ESG than I do, but on its face, lots of potential to reduce risks for investors and companies and to add value, including brand value. That said, right now it is very open-ended and sweeping in its potential implications. If I've learned anything about watching the last couple of decades of public expectation, they're going to grow. So that means there's potential to add risk. And getting to the question, how can public decision processes take ESG ideas, principles, factors on board in a way that in fact reduces risk rather than adding to them? So next slide. Just to give you a bit on what we're doing at Positive Energy, our focus for a program that now goes back 4 years is on public confidence in energy decision making. And the first phase led to a paper, you can see the title there, Canada's Energy Future in an Age of Climate Change, which has become the foundation for what we're now doing in the second phase. And two key concepts, and I'll come back to them later. But one, as decision systems are reformed, is that done in a way that is well informed, and ultimately, is it getting us to something that is balanced and durable? And so we use those two key concepts. Moving on, next slide. Important to make sure we're distinguishing different publics when we think about public confidence. So we talked about the broad public, and we're doing work on that, and I'll come to that in a minute. There's the more, if you will, expert or active or elite public that finds its way into a whole variety of media. There are directly affected local publics, and they're not all the same public by any means. And of course, investors are part of the public as well. So getting public confidence in energy regulatory systems is a complex challenge. Moving on, next slide.
Um, for this phase of the work, we've got three big buckets. One focused on polarization, another on institutional reform, and then looking out to 2021, we're looking at work on consensus building. And I'm going to talk in a little bit about detail about a few of these. One, understanding transition. The second one, unpacking public opinion. And the third, a project that I'm leading on policymakers, regulators, and courts. So moving on. Next slide. The work on transition was done last year. We talked to, actually, I think it was 42 experts covering a broad spectrum of people interested in energy and climate change. And we asked them, first question was, what do you mean by transition? And we got almost as many definitions as we had informants. Now, one of the things we did find was there was convergence on the need for low GHG transformation by mid-century. There's very few people who don't buy into that basic reality. But there's a very, very wide divergence on the pace, obviously, as well as on whether or not there's a future role for fossil fuel. Add to that, and I think this is particularly relevant for ESG, some divergence on scope, with most people focused on low GHG emissions, but others talking about a more fundamental societal transformation. And all of that could possibly bear on the way ESG practices come about, how it gets framed, what are the factors that you take into account. So next slide. Talking about public opinion, this is a big project that started last year, and as the analysis is still ongoing. One of the things that maybe the thing that stands out more above everything is that there is, in few cases, there's agreement. Lots of cases, there's what we call fragmentation, but actual polarization among the general public is much less than you would think from what you see in the media. The optimist in me thinks that maybe a fragmented world has potential for dialogue, and their ESG practices could easily facilitate that, and in particular at the local level. So let's look at examples. Next slide. The first one, basic question, should we be investing tax dollars into retraining workers who may lose their jobs? And what you see there is a strong degree of agreement. Maybe a relatively easy question, but still, that's an example of what we describe as agreement, quote unquote. The next slide. Next slide. Yeah, okay. Here the question is, as it says, phasing out oil and gas production and consumption is not necessary because new technologies will reduce emissions. Here what you see is opinions all over the spectrum, but not polarized, not strongly oriented to one end of the spectrum or the other, but simply, as I say, all across the spectrum. And I like to think that there's potential there for dialogue. The next slide gives you something where it's leaning towards polarization. This one being Canada needs to have a carbon tax that applies across the country, and pretty strong, in fact, very strong disagreement at one end, and pretty strong agreement at the other. So when we're talking about polarization, next slide, we do also need to understand a little better than we have up to this point, and I'm hoping that our work at the University of Ottawa will help. The general public is not anywhere near as polarized as people sometimes seem to think, and what you're getting is maybe perhaps unfairly what I call the shouting classes who dominate the media. That finds its way into partisan politics, and when that happens, that finds its way into public decision processes if we don't understand what lies behind that. So next slide. Looking a lot these days at regulatory processes and the regulatory independence, One of the things that has come across from all of our informants, and pretty obvious to all of you, I think, is that it is a much more complex world of societal expectations. And I won't go through all of these. Everybody will have their own list, but that's been growing more complex, adding more issues, more expectations that decision processes and what investors do will take these kinds of things into account. Next slide. In the meantime, regulators are adapting, and no one's ever said the regulators are the most nimble institution in society, but they're more nimble than you may think. A couple of examples there of initiatives that are underway, one with Positive Energy and Camput, another one with Quest and Pollution Probe, looking at ways of improving innovation and regulatory processes. But the big change, the big kinds of changes that would take into account, for example, the whole range of factors on ESG, needs legislative change and it needs policy guidance. Question is, how can ESG principles or ESG factors contribute to workable policy direction for regulatory agencies? So next slide. And policymakers are adapting, or in some cases just reacting. Don't want to be unfair. It's hard to articulate policy clearly. We've seen 20 years of asking for a Canadian energy and climate change strategy, and we're still waiting. And that's not to blame the politicians. It is hard to do that. Meanwhile, regulators have to live within their statutes. The public and policymakers frustrated that they're not seeing change and an inclination to take decisions out of regulators' hands. It's not obvious that that's a good direction for us to be going. So next slide. When I say that, I think there's certainly little evidence that there's been much effect on broad public confidence, particularly with the big issues. There's definitely divergence between the broader discourse and local interests that makes things more turbulent. And of course, investors are increasingly wary. So wrapping it up, last slide. The question is, how do we better articulate policy upstream of individual applications? Pardon me. And to that extent, what needs to be brought into the picture? Traditional concerns of regulators, but also the kinds of things that people are talking about under the rubric of ESG. So, as I say, our objective is decision processes that produce durable balance and enhance competence. The means to that is informed reform, and the ESG dialogue has potential to contribute to that. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. I think that was a really great finish to our dialogue today around the opportunity, what you're seeing out there, what the public perception is, what the regulatory lay of the land is, where policymakers are at. Glad to see my fellow panelists hopping back on. I thought they were all leaving me, but no, you're back. So, we've got some time for some questions, which I think is great. So let's get to them. We've got a couple that have been asked, and I think I'll go with the first one that's there because I think it's an interesting one. And it reads, why does ESG seem to be applied to Canada only and with such vigor, and yet seemingly not at all applied to other resourcing producing nations? I think that's a perception, real or not, that's out there as we see other countries develop their resources, make decisions, make huge capital investments, recent ones. So maybe I'll start with Cody on that one if you're on the line, your thoughts on that, but I'll go to everyone for some quick thoughts on that question.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. And I think, when we look at the percentage of the world's resources that are publicly investable and located in, democratic, countries, there's going to be a real difference between national companies and then public companies, and just the sort of filter that's applied by investors. So I think it's sort of that comment, that question is an important reminder of the importance of getting Canadian gas into the world market where we can start to compete for market share. And, Susannah also talked about how now customers are now starting to look at what's the ESG what's the climate related impact of the product that they're looking to buy. And hopefully we'll see more of that, where you have a transparent, very transparent opportunity within Canada to continue getting our responsibly produced energy to the world. Thank you.
Thanks, Cody. Susannah, your thoughts on that?
I think Cody actually said it quite well. I think, again, it really depends on the nature of the country and the jurisdiction, where they have various different interests, that are being reflected in how they develop their energy resources. We're proud Canadians. We're a values-oriented nation. And I think for us, it's a point of pride to feel good about the work that we do in developing this energy sector. And so I think for us, that can be reflected in some of the policy direction that we have. And so I think, again, I think our biggest challenge right now is how we continue to maintain that or continual leadership in that space while we compete for investment. And that is the biggest challenge I think we face, which is we know we can do it right, but doing it right requires investment and it requires costs. Being a leader doesn't come for free. Being able to capture carbon and sequester it and develop it doesn't come for free. So when we look at how do we develop policy and how do we continue to demonstrate ESG, we also have to take a look at the competitive challenges with that. And that's where I think the great opportunity for government and the private sector and the nonprofit sector, such as Pembina and others, and the academia and the academic institutions, we can come together and really say, okay, well, what will it take for us to continue on that path? Because let's be clear, the rest of the world may not care as much as we do, but if we truly want to make a difference in terms of how projects are developed, we can show the leadership, but it doesn't come for free.
That's great comments. And Chris, I'll ask for your thoughts on that as well, because you look at the work that you showed us that's being done. I'd be interested in your thoughts on kind of Canada's being unfairly singled out in ESG discussions, or how you feel about that being a foot opportunity for us.
I think it's a perception more than a reality. I think it's something that we ought to challenge that sort of assumption and really take a close look at, well, what are we doing? What are we hearing from our customers and the investors? And I think one of the messages that we're getting is that Canada continues to have a real divide over where it's going in terms of addressing climate change. It's not unified, and that we don't have a strong enough sort of answer to how is Canada going to achieve its climate commitments to the international community. And I think until we are able to demonstrate that, we're going to continue to have problems. And I agree with what Susannah said. There's no, we need to make, this not going to be for free. We have to make investments in order to achieve this. And so anyway, we need to sort of get beyond sort of that kind of defensive, like attacking the world verbally whenever they slight us, and rather like think about what message are we sending and how can we truly back it up in order to, and the way to do that would be to be, more unified on our response to climate change and be able to demonstrate that we're actually following through with it in a really measurable way.
Thanks, Chris. I'm going to get to, we've had a few questions come in, so I'm going to get to those as well, because we only have a few minutes left to get us to as many as I can. But this one's really interesting around, what does a Canadian brand look like vis-a-vis competitors such as the US, and how is it differentiated? I think that's really a lot of the conversation that we're having as a country is, what is our raison d'etre in the energy space? What is the Canadian contribution moving forward? And so I'm interested in everyone's thoughts around, what is our Canadian brand and how can we differentiate ourselves and importantly ladder that into a competitive advantage? Susannah, maybe I'll start with you.
I like it better when you start with others. Why me? Well, and again, I think it kind of speaks to what Chris said. I don't know that we have a unified brand, our Canadian energy brand yet. I think we're still trying to find what that is. I think that there is an opportunity to develop a brand if we're committed to developing low carbon produced energy sources and commodities. And I like the BC Business Council Low Carbon Industrial Strategy, which really looks at how do we drive and promote low carbon commodities for export. But again, that requires a real focused look at what we need to do that. And I think, again, in an ESG-minded world, those things as one factor, carbon becomes important. And I think what Cody reflected on in terms of the leadership position of Canada across a variety of different metrics is another area where we might take a harder look and say, well, is that the brand that we want to continue to promote? And if it is, let's continue to pursue that. But pursuing it just by speaking about it doesn't actually do anything. It's got to be a real commitment. And I do think, even what Mike was saying, we have some fragmentation and we have some fractures, and a lot of it's driven by ideology and politics. But you can find that space where we might agree and create the vision of what we can be. Maybe we can get closer to that.
Thank you. And Cody, maybe I'll get your thoughts on that. You're out in the public sphere all day long talking to Canadians and engaging with them. What are you seeing as those ties that bind within a Canadian brand and those things we can build on as a unifying force, if you will, moving forward?
Well, I think that a lot of people, a lot of Canadians don't necessarily know all of the great things that are being done, the great things that have been done. And a huge, note of congratulations to Chris, Pembina, and 7Gen for that certified natural gas program. I would look to that as a perfect example of where Canada is showing the world that we are a leader. We are a responsible energy leader. We are taking climate action. Alberta, for example, has had carbon pricing on industrial emitters since 2007. We do currently have some of the largest wind and solar. So in this energy transition that will slowly play out, with the need to replace natural gas that's in declining production from other countries and to meet growing demand, we have to look at, I think, Canada's place in the world. And if we can reduce, possibly, or displace some of those emissions elsewhere, I talk to Canadians all the time, Indigenous leaders, tradespeople, who are very excited about Canada's opportunity to be a part of that global solution. And so finding common ground is very important, and making sure that we are being inclusive, very important. And I think continuing to get that positive message out there is so critical about how we are a part of that solution, how we will continue to be a part of that solution.
Thank you, Cody. I'm going to get Mike's thoughts really quickly, especially around your presentation, Mike, and where public policy is. What do we need to do collectively? Because there needs, in my mind, a bit of a call to action coming out of a session like this on what can we continue to do in engaging with policymakers and others around, Canadian brand, if you will. But really, policymakers need they need the support and space to make the policy decisions that need to be made moving forward. So maybe your quick thoughts on that. And then what I'm going to do is go to everyone, because we're running short on time, for a quick minute or two of closing statements. So Mike, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Bryan. That's a big question, but maybe a very small part of the answer, and it's only a very small part, but it's an important one. When we talk about brand, in whose eyes are we talking about brand? And who's not coming through in this big conversation is local communities, where companies, and Susannah will be familiar with this, people are doing some really interesting things that cover the ESG spectrum, but those local community voices are getting drowned out. I'd like to think about some ways we can bring more of those into the picture, if voices can be brought into a picture.
Great, thank you, Mike. So I'm going to go to just a couple of minutes of just closing thoughts from folks, and I'm seeing some of the questions come in, and I'll just touch on them a bit. Maybe you touch on them a little bit, but around technology, what are those technologies we need to continue to look at? I think that's an interesting one as we move forward. What's going to help drive that? Do we need to do more than talk about ESG? How about our performance system? So maybe just a couple of minutes, I'll wrap up from everyone, just generally. And I'll start with Cody, and we'll go back through the group. So over to you, Cody.
Yeah, thanks, Bryan. I think we have this real opportunity to continue bringing people together, to get Canadian energy to the world, and to continue investing in clean technology and all these other important aspects of this transition that's going to happen over the coming decades. So, I would just like to thank my, Mike and Chris and Susannah and yourself and Natural Gas World again for having us, and really encourage people to be looking at how Canada can continue to be a part of that solution. A great example that Pembina has done with 7Gen, certifying that natural gas, and great work from Mike with, who is seeing the information and what community is looking at this data and how are we getting those facts out to the public. We need to all get unified, governments, industry, and to be able to attract that investment that I think Canada should really be a choice jurisdiction for. We have the resource, we have the people, we have the know-how, and I think we're doing a good job and we're always trying to improve. So thank you very much for having me today.
Thank you, Cody. Great to have you here. Susannah, over to you. I mean, obviously you're representing what will be and have helped to build what will be the cleanest LNG facility in the world. We have so much to celebrate in that regard, and we can continue down that path. And I think, so anyway, over to you for your thoughts.
Yeah, and I guess maybe just in closing, I think, as I said before, like a pro athlete, you got to train every day to be better than the guy who's coming behind you, the woman who's coming behind you. We need to consider our industry as the same thing. We compete. And so every day we need to wake up and think about what are they doing that we can continue to compete in the world in terms of the energy that we're producing. And as we talked about today, ESG is increasingly a factor in that competition. So we have to think every day what we can do. And it does come down to technology for sure. The technology that might even be available today, electrification of the upstream, but it's expensive. Technology that might be available tomorrow, CCS, CCUS, but it's expensive. Technology that we can potentially see into the future of digitization and blockchain, but this takes time, effort, and expense. So again, for us, I think it comes down to where do we think we want to be? And then let's bring all of the efforts of people like you see on the panel here today together to design that plan. But recognize that one of the best things that we can do right now is to grow out of this pandemic, and it requires investment. It requires competitive investment. And so building back better means it must be competitive. We must be focused on the right technologies and investments so that we can be a part of this ESG world that I think is a great opportunity for all of us here.
Thank you. Chris, over to you for some thoughts.
I agree with a lot of what has already been said. Just to add to it, perhaps, is that, I think we need to follow through and come up with a tangible way of actually meeting our national target. And I think we need to be able to demonstrate to the rest of the world, to investors, our customers, that we have that kind of policy and regulatory framework in place, and we're prepared to invest in it and be transparent about how we're going to achieve it. And I think in order to accomplish that, we need to pull together. I mean, and sort of there will be opposition. Continued opposition, and there will continue to be a polarized discussion happening within Canada, and because not everybody is going to be able to make that shift, right? Not every investment that's been made in the past is going to survive that kind of a change. But especially in the natural gas industry, there's a lot of opportunities, and I think people in the sector need to be quite vocal about the kind of future that we want to have and how climate change action is consistent with their corporate objectives in the long run.
Thank you, Chris. Mike, over to you.
Maybe I just kind of go back to the last page in my deck. I'm not asking you to put it up there, but just that's referring to it. And the question is, can we get better at articulating policy? Right now, approval processes tend to be ad hoc. They tend to be very uncertain. They tend to be made in a context where policy is unclear or it's unstable, and often more rhetorical than real. So we're going to need to find a way to put a more stable foundation under those processes. And if it's a foundation that involves that broad range of public expectations, let's get it out on the table and talk about what it really involves, including what it really costs.
Thank you, Mike. I see Dale has popped back up on the screen. I know our time is over. In fact, we've gone a few minutes over because we were having such a good dialogue. And I just want to say my thanks to Natural Gas World for setting up these dialogues, for staying resilient during these times and ensuring that we stay connected. to each other. I'd like to thank all of the panelists. It's been just a pleasure to engage with you today. You're all experts in your field. And I think you've all demonstrated to all of us that it's only by working together that we're going to move forward. There's broad commitment to do that. And I think that's the key moving forward that we all should take from this. So again, thank you to all of you on the call and on the line today for taking time out of your day. Stay healthy and safe. Dale, over to you, and thanks again.
Thanks very much, Brian. Yeah, we've got the gas, we've got the tools. Now all we have to do is make sure everybody knows that we have the gas and the tools to do it right and to contribute to the transition to a greener economy, whether that means decarbonization or who knows what it means. It's coming, we can contribute to it, and I'd like to thank you all for your thoughts on this. That's it for today's session. Remember to please join us again a week from today on September 28th, when we'll get into some of the nitty-gritty of producing gas in Canada, and that's mostly getting it to market. Please join us then, and until then, thanks very much and keep well.